going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you an updated meta-analysis for the March 2018 format. March has been a bit of a slow month for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, but with the conclusion of YCS Costa Rica, with a 400-person regional taking place in San Diego, California, and with YCS Salt Lake City right around the corner, there's a lot I want to discuss and kind of give you guys advice on how the meta is starting to trend, and give you guys some advice on what you need to look out for if you plan on attending YCS Salt Lake City or any large tier 2 or above event moving forward for the duration of this format. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout out today to Mamoosh, to William, as well as Monty. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to do this meta analysis a little bit differently than I normally would, because since we haven't had a lot of premier events to go by, we don't really exactly have a lot of, definitive solid results that we can kind of compare and contrast to make the overarching pie chart that you guys are used to. What I'm going to start with, though, is the pie chart of the top 32 breakdown from YCS Costa Rica. Now, when you first look at this pie chart in comparison to the pie chart of, the beginning of the month, or pretty much since we've gotten the February 2018 ban list, this is pretty much indicative of what we've come to expect of this current format. We have Pendulum Magician as the best deck, or the most represented deck as well. We have True Draco sitting in a pretty comfortable second place, and then we just have a conglomerate of different clusterfuck type decks taking up the last third or so of the top 32 representation. Now, what's interesting about this is, one thing you guys have to keep in mind is with YCS Costa Rica, Central and South American YCSs are a little bit different than North American or European YCSs because the turnout isn't as high in comparison. This YCS only had about 200 players, and while the skill gap might have been a little bit higher than, say, in comparison to something like a regional, because there are good players that are going to make the travel to these events, you have to realize that because it's a much lower cap, decks that are taking up that last third slot, like as you can see something like Cubics, have a much greater chance of sneaking in and making that top 32 cut because it's less rounds that these decks have to play through. The reason why these other decks manage to just solidify their top slots is because they're able to play through 10, 11 rounds of a YCS and solidify themselves as a dominant force in a current meta. But when you have less rounds, it gives these decks more of an opportunity because they don't have to have as much variance by comparison in compared to the other decks. So even if a deck might be a little bit less consistent or something like that, you might see something sneak in the top 32 cut. Not to take anything away from the player who did manage to make it, because it's still quite the accomplishment, but it's something you guys have to keep in mind when interpreting these results. But overall, even though it is a lower player count by comparison, when you look at these results, this is exactly what we've gotten used to. I mean, one of the big changes, I think, in comparison to some of the past events, or what we've come to expect, is really the fall off of Trickstar. Now, Pendulum Magician and True Draco are pretty much sitting exactly where they have been in the past. If anything, I'd actually say True Draco has solidified an even bigger foothold in this format than it did before. Pendulum Magician, I would say, is kind of falling in line with some past events as well. They also differentiated Pendulum Magician from Dark Pendulum if you're keeping up on any of the event coverage. I still don't 100% know the difference between the two. Some people were saying that Dark Pendulum doesn't play Wisdom Eye and Oath Dragon and opts to play stuff like Allure of Darkness, but then you look at the first place deck list and it's playing Wisdom Eye and Oath Dragon and Allure of Darkness, and it's considered Dark Pendulum. So I think it's really odd that they made these distinctions between the two decks, because frankly, even if you modify like 5 cards in the deck, it's still Pendulum Magician. So I like this pie chart here courtesy of Carlancho Store, because they pretty much just melded it all together, because it's still Pendulum Magician no matter which way you look at it. Now, the thing is, when we get to Trickstar actually had probably a good solid tie for second or maybe even third place when it came to top cut representation from the past major YCSs. However, only taking 2 of the top 32 slots is really interesting. Now again, because this is a Central or South American YCS, there could be a little bit of deviation here, so it's something to keep in mind, but ultimately maybe people aren't in favor of Trickstar in comparison to something like Draco. And like I said, back in the original March meta analysis, I felt that if if Draco had a stronger foothold in the format, that Trickstar is going to die down, because Trickstar has a very difficult time dealing with the true Draco matchup. So maybe this is coming to fruition. I can't say 100% for sure, but if anything, this might be something and give us a little bit of insight as to what YCS Salt Lake City's meta might look like going forward. There's also some decks that managed to sneak in a top cut as well. Invoke Mech Knight was there. We also had a World Chalice again. Again, cubic deck, which no one saw that coming whatsoever, but I think that's a bit of an anomaly and shouldn't be something to consider that as a just formidable meta-defining option. It's one of those things that someone played it and they managed to get to the top 32, and that's fantastic, but don't expect it to be just overwhelmingly dominating the meta anytime soon. So that's it for YCS Costa Rica, and when you see the top 8 and top 4 as the top 32 started to play it out, this is when you start getting to the more traditional meta decks. The top 8 was like 4 Pendulum Magician, 3 Draco, and a Trickstar, and then the top 4 was like 2 Pen Magician, a Draco, and a Trickstar. So this is very representative of the meta we've come to know and love at the current point in time. Now, when we get to the 400-person regional that took place in San Diego, this is really cool because that means you have to play 9 rounds. This means it had a bigger turnout than a YCS, and I like to value regional results when they have a very large representation, typically in California, in Texas, sometimes on the East Coast they might have huge ones in Pennsylvania, things like that, but those are the results you really want to look at, because when you have a much higher representation, again, like I said, you have to play more rounds, so those wins have a lot more validity to them than, say, something like a 40 or a 50-person regional. Now, the big thing about this was the fact that Invoked Mech Knight managed to win the entire tournament. I believe it went 9-0, and that's a really big deal. Now, again, we've seen Invoked Mech Knight pop up. It made a top 32 at YCS Costa Rica, and it's managed to make the top cut of other YCS level events as well. And this is still a very formidable deck, and the fact that it took first place at a large event like this goes to show that the deck is still very viable. One interesting thing that came out of this 400-person regional was what people are deeming the field spell deck that took second place. This is a deck that plays about like 12 different field spells, including terraformings, and it's really cool because it's able to turbo out Nap Beast, it plays Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, it plays Fairy Tale Snow, it plays like every weird engine you could think of under the sun, and it somehow works. I mean, it's cool because it takes advantage of utilizing Armageddon Knight and Destrudo to get into Ancient Fairy Dragons. You can tutor out a lot of your different field spells, and ultimately, because you're playing a small sub-terror engine, you're able to get into a Naturia Beast rather easily as a result of that. So I don't know if this is going to be a new trend that we might see people trying to spice up going into YCS Salt Lake City, or maybe it was just a one and done type of instance. However, the fact that it did get second place is a really big deal and something you definitely should be aware of moving forward into this format. And then there was also a 5th place player playing a 44 card Lightsworn Dino deck, so it really is just going to show that even though Pendulum Magician and True Draco are still the best decks of the format, realistically, anything has a really good probability of being able to top. Now, obviously, some decks have a stronger probability than others, but the fact that there's still this huge amount of diversity just really goes to show how much people are loving this format, how much people are trying to experiment with the new things, and how that these decks actually have a chance to succeed at a tier 2 or higher level event. Now, one big thing moving into YCS Salt Lake City is the fact that Called by the Grave is going to be legal for that event and every event thereafter. Called by the Grave becomes legal this Friday, I believe March 23rd, and this is going to be not necessarily a format warping card, but it's going to be a card that might become a auto staple in either the main or side deck of a lot of competitive players. What you have to realize is that Called by the Grave was actually the 3rd most played card in the OCG ever since its release, or I guess ever since people realized how good it was, because it negates hand traps. This card basically changes the whole dynamic of the hand trap game and how people now, where it's like, oh, I don't have a way to negate a hand trap other than something like Gamma. Well, now you do, and if you have this card to stop your opponent's hand traps, it's going to be a really big deal because this is going to just completely shift the way a lot of different decks function, and I'm going to be really excited to see how this card makes an impact going into YCS Salt Lake City and future events thereafter. I think this is something you guys definitely need to be aware of, especially when it comes to your deck building, because if hand traps are your worst nightmare, you're definitely going to want to main 3 this card in your main deck, or at least in your side deck, so that when you opt to go first, you can side this card in and have a much higher probability of your combos going off, establishing your turn 1 board, and being really solid going into the further turns of the game. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the meta as a whole and how you guys have been enjoying the format. I really think it's so awesome that a lot of decks just have a lot of potential at the moment. You've got dinosaurs, you've got Invoked Mech Knight, you've got Draco, you've got Pen Magician, you've got World Chalice still hanging in there, you've got Lightsworn Zombie. There's just so many different decks that I'm really loving this format, and I really hope that, you know, we can continue this, because aside from the fact that Pen Magician is obviously the strongest deck, I think a lot of people are really happy with this format as a whole. But guys, again, those are just my thoughts. I'd really love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time. 1, 2, 3,